Okay, everybody, welcome to the lab test review on the skeletal system. This is the first installment of this particular unit. This is going to go over the axial skeleton, and of course we start with the typical cautionary warning: do not use this material as a substitute for going to biosis or attending lab and doing the exercises. This is simply meant to augment your performance on the practicals and the exams. So we'll start here with just a general tour of the skeleton, and let's go through the bones indicated here. You can see the skull, of course, which houses the brain and features mostly immovable bones. The only movable bone in the skull is the mandible, the lower jaw, as we will see shortly. The clavicle or collarbone, the sternum, false ribs, which are connected to the sternum via a cartilage attachment to another cartilage attachment, which then attaches to the sternum. And of course, the remaining two false ribs, which we call floating ribs, which have no attachment to the sternum whatsoever. The humerus, which is the long bone of the upper arm, the lumbar vertebrae, which are part of the vertebral column, the ulna, which is the bone on the little finger side of the forearm in anatomical position, the os coxa, which are a set of paired bones that make up the pelvic girdle. The os coxa has three parts to it: the ilium, which is this large crested portion, the ischium, which you sit on, and the pubis, which is down in front. The sacrum, which sits at the inferior aspect of the vertebral column, made up of 5 fused vertebrae. The radius, which is on the thumb side of the forearm in anatomical position. The femur, the longest and strongest bone in the body, the bone of the upper leg. The patella, which is your kneecap. The tibia, which is the medial strut of your lower leg. And the fibula, which is the lateral strut of your lower leg. And here you can see a quick diagram of the axial skeleton. This is what we'll be covering today, made up again of the skull, the vertebral column, the sternum, the ribs, the sacrum, the coccyx, and sometimes we include the pelvic and the pectoral girdle in the axial skeleton as well. You can see here the anterior and the posterior view. You've got some shading indicating in blue here the cartilage component of the axial skeleton, and the stuff that's in tan or dark brown is the mineralized bone. Okay, so let's take a look at the skull first. We want to identify the bones indicated by the arrows on this set of slides. And so let's begin with this bone here. I'll give you 2 seconds to name. That is the frontal bone. This bone here, 2 seconds. The nasal bone forming the bridge of the nose. This bone here, the parietal bone, which sits posterior to the frontal bone and anterior to this bone, which is the occipital bone. Okay, you'll notice that the divisions between these bones are a series of these sort of squiggly lines. This is an immovable joint called a suture, and due to its category as an immovable joint, we deem it a synarthrotic joint. Okay, this is the skull from the underside. What we want to do is identify this bone here, which makes up the inferior portion of the nasal septum, and that would be the vomer. And this bone here, which articulates with C1, the first cervical vertebrae, and this is the occipital bone. Okay, the occipital bone covers the occipital lobe of the brain. Most of the flat bones of the skull are named for the bones, or named for the lobes of the brain that they cover. So for instance, the parietal bones cover the parietal lobe, the frontal bone covers the frontal lobe, and so forth. So remember these flat bones of the skull when we get to the unit on the brain. The occipital lobe of the brain is where we process visual information, and this is why sometimes when you get struck on the chin, um, if the brain rocks back against the occipital bone, you'll get visual disturbances and see little stars and planets and flashes of light. Here we have a lateral view of the skull, and what we want to know is what is the name of this bone here? Okay, that is the temporal bone. What is this bone here? That is the ethmoid. Okay, this bone here, which contains a little impression here and a little opening down here, is the lacrimal bone. And this bone that forms your cheek, that is the zygomatic bone, and the bone of the upper jaw is the maxilla. Okay, moving on, another sagittal or lateral view. We want to know, what is this bone? Okay, this is one of the internal bones of the skull. It has the nickname the keystone of the cranium. This is the sphenoid bone. Next question, what is this bone here, which contains an opening and a small indentation that leads into the nasal cavity? And this is the lacrimal bone. Next question, what is this bone here that forms the cheek? This is the zygomatic bone. And what is this bone, the only movable bone of the skull? And this is, of course, the mandible. Notice that the mandible articulates with the temporal bone to form the temporomandibular joint right here. Okay, so if you're asked on an exam, what bone does the mandible articulate with? We're asking for the joint that is formed, and the joint that is formed is the TMJ joint, and the bone with which it articulates is the temporal bone. Okay, and last question, what is this bone? The temporal bone. Now we're looking at the skull from the underside again, and what we want to know is, what is this bone here that forms the anterior 2/3 of the roof of the mouth? And the answer is the maxilla. Now you might ask, well, wait a minute now, I thought that formed the upper jaw. Well, it does. It forms the upper jaw, but it's these processes that protrude towards midline, called the palatine processes of the maxilla, that form the anterior 2/3 of the roof of the mouth. Next question, what is this bone here? And I'll give you a hint. The mandible articulates with it. This is the temporal bone. And then down here, what forms the posterior 1/3 of the hard palate? And the answer is the palatine bones. The palatine bones. The palatine bones have an L shape. If you review the video on the skull that's posted on Angel on the lessons tab in the lab portion of the course, there's a very nice video showing you how all the bones of the skull articulate and how they look disarticulated as well. Okay, we have another view here. Next question, what is this bone here? This is the ethmoid bone. Next question, what is this bone here? And this is the sphenoid bone, also known as the keystone of the cranium, because it articulates with every other bone in the skull. Okay. Next question, what is this bone down here that forms the inferior portion of the nasal septum? And that is going to be the vomer. And then what's the bone here that forms the bridge of the nose? The nasal bone. Okay. All right, moving on. Anterior view of the skull. Okay. We want to ask the question, what forms this portion of the orbit which holds the eyeball? This is the back portion of the orbit. And again, this is formed by the keystone of the cranium, and that is the sphenoid bone. Next question, what forms the upper portion of the nasal septum? And that is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay. And then down here, what is this bone? What is this bone here? Okay, again, the mandible articulates with it. This is the temporal bone. And then finally, what is this bone here? This little tiny bump on the lateral wall, the inferior lateral portion of the nasal cavity, and that is the inferior nasal concha. Okay, and then finally, what is this protrusion right here? This is actually also part of the ethmoid bone. This is the middle nasal concha. Okay, now you might ask, okay, well, big deal. What's the significance of those bony protrusions? And the answer is that they're covered by mucous membrane, and when you breathe in, what they do is they cause the air inside the nasal cavity to swirl about, causing it to come into more extensive contact with the mucous membranes. This causes the air that you inhale to humidify, to warm up, and as a result reduces the potential damage it could inflict once it gets into the lungs. Okay, so that's the significance of those ridges. Okay, we're looking at the floor of the cranium, okay, and we want to know, what is this bone? This is the frontal bone. Next question, what is this bone? I will trace it. I'm tracing it right now, okay. This again is the keystone of the cranium, the sphenoid bone. Now, what is this bone back here? I'm tracing it around. This is the occipital bone. Next question, what is this bone right here? Well, this is the roof of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is a very unusual bone. The features on the top of the ethmoid bone include this ridge called the crista galli, and these two plates that jut out at right angles to it, and these are called the cribriform plates, and they contain little tiny holes through which the olfactory epithelial cells, the neurons that are part of the olfactory bulb, can protrude, and this provides your sense of smell. Okay, so this lies directly above the nasal cavity. The significance of the crista galli is this is where the many of the meningeal membranes that cover and protect the brain attach. Okay. All right, next question. What is this bone here? This bone right here, and this is the temporal bone. Okay, next question. Is this bone superior or inferior to the atlas and the axis? Well, first thing we want to do is identify this bone. Do not confuse this bone with the mandible. This bone is inferior to the mandible, and this bone is called the hyoid bone. It is unique because it does not articulate with any other bone in the body. Okay, and is it superior or inferior to the atlas and the axis? And the answer, it is inferior to both C1 and C2. Next question, is this bone superior or inferior to the clavicle? It is superior to the clavicle. Next thing we want to do is identify the sutures indicated by the arrows in these next slides. So, question number 1, what is this suture here? Well, this suture is named for the plane that it cuts through the skull. This is the coronal suture. Next, we want to know, what is the name of this suture here? Okay, this is the squamosal suture. And the next question, we want to know, what is this suture here? This suture is shaped like the Greek letter lambda. This is the lambdoidal suture, Okay. Next question, this is the cranium from the top, and first thing we want to understand is what is front and what is back in this view. Okay. Well, this is would represent the anterior of the cranium. This would be the posterior of the cranium. So this will be the frontal bone. This will be the occipital bone. And the first question we want to ask is, what is this suture here? This is the sagittal suture, so named for the plane that it cuts through the skull. Next question, what is this suture here? This again is the coronal suture, named for the plane that it cuts through the skull. And then finally, what is this suture at the back, shaped like the Greek letter lambda? That is the lambdoidal suture. Synarthroses are interesting because they are the least easily injured joints of the body due to the fact that they're the least mobile. In taking the sutures in the skull as a particular example, these don't actually start out as synarthroses. They actually start out as amphiarthrotic joints with cartilage between them. When you're born, there is a considerable amount. This is why newborn infants often have a soft spot in the tops of their heads, because the flat bones of the skull have yet to fuse. And as we age, what happens is that these things knit, and as a result now fully encase and protect the brain. Next thing we want to do is identify some of the bone markings on the next set of the slide. And you might ask, well, gee, why do we have to know these bone markings, these protrusions, these indentations, these projections? What is their significance? Well, number one, protrusions often represent sites of attachment for ligaments and tendons. Okay, so this is why we need to know where they're located. Indentations also represent sites of attachment for ligaments and tendons, and holes called foramina or canals mark passageways for nerves or blood vessels. And so this is one of the reasons we want to become familiar with these markings. So let's take a quick tour here. Okay, we want to know first of all, what is this protrusion that's coming off the temporal bone? Okay, well, what I want you to notice here is that this protrusion is reaching out to meet the zygomatic bone. So we name this the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Next question we want to ask, what is this hole here? This is the external auditory meatus. This is the passage through which the eighth cranial nerve, known as the vestibulocochlear nerve, runs. If we follow the external auditory meatus through to its opening inside the skull, what we would find is an internal auditory meatus that enters on the other side of the temporal bone. Next question, what is the name for this pointed projection here? For those of you that still own record players or that used to own record players, you might remember that another name for the needle on a record player is the stylus, hence the name here, the styloid process. And then finally, what is this projection here on the mandible? And this is the coronoid process of the mandible. Now, one of the ways to remember this, very often this can be confused with another process. It's actually on the scapula called the coracoid process. The way I remember this is the mandible has an N in it. The coronoid process has an N in it. So I always think of N goes with N, whereas the scapula has a C in it. The coracoid process has a C in it. Hence the coracoid process goes with the scapula. You can use any mnemonic you like. This just happens to be the one that I use. Okay, moving on. What is this indentation here? And I'll give you a hint. This is the point at which the mandible articulates with the temporal bone, and this is the mandibular fossa. Fossa is another anatomical term for an indentation. Next question. What is this protrusion here, this smooth protrusion? This smooth protrusion is called a condyle. Okay, any smooth protrusion can be called a condyle, and it's on the occipital bone, hence this is the occipital condyle. This articulates with the atlas. Okay. Next question. What is this protrusion on the temporal bone? And this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now, interestingly enough, it meets with the protrusion of the zygomatic bone called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, which is right there. Okay, so they form here the bridge that makes up your cheekbones. Okay, what is this big hole right here? Well, this big hole is basically going to bear the Latin name for big hole, which is foramen magnum. Foramen meaning hole, magnum meaning big. Okay, here we're seeing the only movable bone of the skull. This is the mandible. And first question we want to ask is, what is this smooth projection here? This is the mandibular condyle. Next question, what is this hole here? Okay, this hole is a passageway for blood vessels and nerves into the mandible, and as a result this bears the name the mandibular foramen. And then finally, what is this smoothed process? And this is the coronoid process of the mandible. Okay. Okay. Finally, what is this little hole right here? Well, if you remember your map of the human body from the very first chapter in A&P, this is the mental region of the skull. Hence, this is the mental foramen. Okay. Moving on, what is this process here? The zygomatic process of the temporal bone. What is this structure here, this flattened structure? This is the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone, the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone. What is this indentation right here? Well, this is the lacrimal fossa of the lacrimal bone. This is where the tears flow as they're produced by the lacrimal glands flowing across the front of the eye to keep it moist and clean it, and then flowing into the lacrimal fossa, into the lacrimal canal, and finally into the nasolacrimal sac, into the nasal cavity, So this is why when you tear, your nose runs. Okay, what is this large flap jutting out from this bone here? Well, first let's identify this bone. This is the sphenoid bone. This large flap of bony tissue, this is the greater wing of the sphenoid. Next question, what is this ridge here? Well, this is the cristogali of the ethmoid bone. And then finally, what is this indentation? This indentation is called the pituitary fossa, and it lies in the middle of something called the sella turcica, and this is a major feature of the sphenoid bone. So your pituitary gland sits right in that little pocket. So from ridge to indentation to ridge, that's the sella turcica. The actual pit down here is the pituitary fossa. Okay, next question. What is this hole right here? You should remember that that's the mental foramen of the mandible. Next question, what is this opening in the temporal bone? This is the external auditory meatus of the temporal bone. And then finally, what is this protrusion on the inferior lateral portion of the temporal bone? This is the mastoid process. And then finally, what is this pointing process off the end of the temporal bone? This is the styloid process of the temporal bone. Now, why do we make a big deal out of these processes? They have to be points of attachments for jaw muscles. Okay, so this is one of the reasons that they're a big deal. You can feel the mastoid process if you put your index finger behind your ear, that little bony bump, that's the mastoid process right there. Okay, next question. Here we are looking at the underside of the skull. We want to know, what is this plate-like projection that projects medially? And this is the palatine process of the maxilla that forms now the anterior two-thirds of the hard palate. While we're on the topic of the hard palate, I wanted to mention that there is a condition in which the palatine processes of the two maxillary bones fail to fuse at midline, and this is a condition known as cleft palate. Children who are born with this need to have it surgically repaired, or else they'll have difficulty nursing, as they'll aspirate food and formula into the nasal cavity, which can get into the upper respiratory system. Okay, anterior view of the skull. We want to know, what is this divider of the septum. Remember, this is the superior portion of the septum, so this is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. And then down here, what is this little ridge or bump? This is the middle nasa concha of the ethmoid bone. Here we're looking again at the floor of the cranium. We want to know, what is this plate that sticks out at a right angle to the cristogali that has little holes in it? This is the cribiform plate of the ethmoid. It lies right on top of the nasal cavity. And then down here, we want to know, what is this tiny projection, this tiny flap of bone that protrudes out from this particular bone here? Well, remember, this is the sphenoid bone, right? And this little projection is the lesser wing of the sphenoid. Okay, next thing we want to address, we want to name the sinus associated with the appropriate bone. And so, again, the name of the sinus is going to bear the name of the bone. So this should be fairly straightforward. We'll start here with this bone. What is this bone? It's the frontal bone. What sinus would be in here? The frontal sinus. Next bone. What is this bone here? This is the maxilla. So what sinus will be in here? The maxillary sinus. Next question. This bump here behind the ear, that's part of the temporal bone. What sinus would be located in here? This would be the mastoid sinus. The mastoid sinus. Okay. The maxillary and the frontal sinus also are sometimes referred to in a group as the paranasal sinuses, meaning that they surround the nasal cavity. So you've got some in the frontal bone, you've got some in the sphenoid, some in the maxilla, and of course you're going to have some in the ethmoid as well. Okay. All right, floor of the cranium. We want to know what sinus would lie in this bone. This is the sphenoid bone again, and so the sphenoid sinus would lie in here. Next question, what sinus would lie in this bone? Well, if you recall, This is the ethmoid bone, so it would contain the ethmoid sinus. Now, incidentally, while we're on the topic of the skull, I want you to think for a minute about the order in which bones appear as we go from the bridge of the nose back. And we'll start here with the nasal bones. This is followed by, right behind the nasal bone, the ethmoid bone, okay? And then behind the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone. So if we were to go straight back, okay, that's the order in which we would encounter those bones. It's just sort of a way to kind of keep you oriented. To orient you with the rest of what you're looking at here, this is the maxilla, the nasal bone, the lacrimal bone, the ethmoid bone, the zygomatic bone, and then back here, that's the sphenoid bone. And this, of course, is the frontal bone. Okay, on to the vertebral column. First question we want to answer is, how many cervical vertebrae are there? The answer is 7. Next question, how many thoracic vertebrae? And the answer is 12. Next question, how many lumbar vertebrae? The answer is 5. Next question, the sacrum is composed of how many fused vertebrae? The answer is 5. And then finally, the coccyx is composed of between 3 and 5 fused vertebrae, depending on the individual. Okay, first question, what are these bones? These are vertebra, okay? And what we want to do here is we want to identify which of these is a cervical, which of these is a thoracic, and which of these is a lumbar vertebrae. Okay, so one thing that should be obvious if you look at the vertebral column is that the vertebrae get larger the lower down on the column you go. And the reason for that is the lower on the column you go, the more weight you have to support. So the lumbar vertebrae are going to be the biggest group, followed by the thoracic vertebrae, and then the lightest group are going to be the cervical vertebrae. Okay, so you can immediately look in terms of size, and that'll be a giveaway as to the division. Another giveaway as to which division is which is if you look at these projections here that are called the spinous processes, okay, which always project posteriorly and inferiorly on the vertebrae, okay. So this is a way for you to determine front from back, okay. This would be front, this would be back, and also top from bottom, okay. In order to have the vertebrae sitting on its bottom, the spinous process is going to have to project backwards and downwards, okay. If it's pointing up, you've got the thing upside down. Okay, as to the spinous processes of the different divisions, in the cervical division, if there is a spinous process, it's going to have a forked end. For the thoracic division, there will be no forked end to the spinous process. It will be sort of pointed, but a little bit blunt. And then finally, the lumbar division is going to have an extremely squared off, blunt spinous process. Another clue as to which division these vertebrae belong to, the cervical vertebrae are the only ones with the transverse foramina in them, because these are passageways for the vertebral arteries, veins, and nerves. Okay, what are transverse foramina? These little holes right here. Okay, so if you don't see these, then you know that it's not a cervical vertebrae. So now, how do you differentiate a lumbar vertebrae from a thoracic vertebrae? And one of the easiest ways I know to do that is if you hold the vertebra up and look at the spinous process in the proper orientation. If you're looking at a thoracic vertebrae, the back of it will look like the face of a giraffe, whereas the back of a lumbar vertebrae will look like the face of a moose. Okay, and we'll see that as we move on and look at some of the other slides here. So the question becomes, which is which on this picture? Okay, this is your cervical, this is your thoracic, and this here is your lumbar. Okay. Next question, what are these collections of fused vertebrae? This is the sacrum, okay, and this is the coccyx. The sacrum is made up of 5 fused vertebrae. The coccyx is made up of between 3 and 5 fused vertebrae. Here it happens to be 4, okay. Moving on, label the structures on this vertebrae. First of all, this is a thoracic vertebra, okay? This area here, this is the centrum or the body. Next question, what is this flattened surface here? This is the superior articular process. Okay, what does that mean? It's on the top of the vertebrae. Okay, so we're looking at the top in this view. It touches something else, okay, so it's an articular surface, and it's a process because it juts out from the surface of the bone. Next question, what is this protrusion? And this is the spinous process. Next question, what are these two protrusions here? Well, they project transversely, so these are the transverse processes. And finally, what is this hole? This is the vertebral foramen. This is what the spinal cord passes through. Okay, moving on. Which one of these two vertebrae is a thoracic vertebrae and which is a lumbar? And now you get this thing I was trying to tell you about giraffe and moose. Okay, so if you take a look here, okay, notice that this, if you can imagine it, use your imagination, but this looks like the face here of a giraffe. Okay, you can see the ears, you can see the little protrusions up top that look like little antennae. Okay, so this is your thoracic vertebrae. And question here, this looks like a moose. Okay, you'd have to kind of hold it up a bit. This is your lumbar vertebrae. All right, the way that you tell the difference between the two, the, the little antennae for the giraffe are processes that articulate with similar processes on the inferior aspect of the vertebrae just above it, and here the processes have a different orientation. Okay. All right. Next question. Which specific vertebra has no body? That is the atlas. Next question. Which specific vertebra has a dens? That is the axis. Next question, which type of vertebra articulate with the ribs? And those are the thoracic vertebrae, also known as the vertebrosternal ribs. Okay, they articulate both with the sternum and with the vertebrae. Okay, so the thoracic vertebrae articulate with the vertebrosternal or true ribs. Next question, which vertebra articulates with the occipital bone? That is the atlas. Next question, with what do the superior articular surfaces of the vertebrae articulate? And they articulate with the inferior articular facets of the vertebrae above it. Next question, what vertebra is referred to as C1 and which is referred to as C2? C1 is the atlas and C2 is the axis. Okay, next question. We're looking at these little brown areas here. Okay, see them? Indicated by the black arrows. They're asking you, what are these? Okay, well, these are intervertebral discs, and they form amphiarthrotic joints that go all the way down the vertebral column. Alone, they don't provide a lot of movement, but their combined action allows the spine to swivel and sway. As we age, these intervertebral discs become more fibrous, and as a result, we're less prone to slip discs. As we are in our younger state, there has a nucleus pulposus, a liquid center to each of these discs, which under extreme pressure can bulge out and impinge on the spinal cord, and this is what we call a slip disc. Okay, next question. Identify the two specific vertebrae labeled 1 and 2 on this slide. Number 1, that is the axis. See the dens, okay? And number 2, this is the atlas, and you can see here the superior articular facets that are going to hold the occipital condyles, okay? Next question, identify the structures on these vertebrae. This, of course, is the dens. Next, this is the superior articular facet. Down here, this is the, this area here is the centrum. And then finally over here, this is the transverse foramen through which the vertebral artery, vein, and nerve run. Okay. Next question, which specific vertebra is seen here? And what foramen is on this vertebrae? This is, again, the axis. This is a superior view, and these are the transverse foramina. Next question. Identify these indicated structures on the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so this is the vertebrae that are in the chest region, and what articulates with these surfaces. Well, first thing you should know about thoracic vertebrae is articulate with ribs. Okay, and so what we want to do is look at each of these different structures. So what is this little indentation here? This is a costal facet, and it articulates with the tubercle of the rib. Okay, what is this little dimple right here? This is a superior costal demifacet. It articulates with the head of the rib, and down here is the inferior costal demifacet, which also articulates with the head of the rib. Moving on, what is this process here? Okay, remember these are the antennae of the giraffe face, okay, and those are the superior articular processes, and they articulate with the inferior articular process of the vertebrae above it. And then down here, what is this protrusion? And this is the inferior articular process, okay, and it articulates with the superior articular process of the rib below it. Okay, moving on. What are we looking at here? The labeled markings are indicated. Superior articular processes of the sacrum. These are the ala or wings of the sacrum. This is the median sacral crest, this little ridge of bone here, which represents the fused spinous processes. And this, of course, is the sacral canal, Okay, let's move on to the sternum and the ribs. I like this drawing. Look at this drawing and kind of keep it in your head, because this shows you the true, the false, and the floating ribs. Okay, the ones in red are the true ribs. Notice that they have a independent attachment to the sternum. Okay, you can see here, bing, 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 all the way down. Notice that up here, this is going to be rib number 1. Okay, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These are the true ribs. They attach to cartilage, which in turn attaches to the sternum. So that's why they're called true. And posteriorly articulate with the thoracic vertebrae. Down here, these are the false ribs. Okay, so you can see them here. You've got 3 of those, and they articulate with cartilage that in turn articulates with another piece of cartilage that articulates with the sternum. And then these last 2, these are the floating ribs, okay? And the floating ribs have no attachment to the sternum whatsoever, okay? And represent a danger for individuals that are engaged in contact sports, because if you knock one of these free, they can puncture an organ. So they represent an extreme danger. The kidneys lie right about here, okay? So if we look here, what we're doing is we removed the ribs and the vertebrae, and we're just looking here at the sternum and the costal cartilage. Okay, so this is the costal cartilage of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th ribs. These are the 3 costal cartilages of the false ribs, and the floaters, of course, have no cartilaginous attachment whatsoever. So what are these 3 parts of the sternum called? Well, that's the manubrium, followed by the body, followed by the xiphoid process. The heart lies right behind this bone. The xiphoid process is a major landmark for EMTs because it's used in cardiopulmonary resuscitation in an attempt to massage the heart until the heart can be stimulated via an AED or any other device that an emergency med tech might have on hand, and to start it beating again. Okay, what structure is indicated by the blue arrow? And that is costal cartilage. Okay. Okay, moving on, we want to know what is this little bump here? This is a rib. Okay, that little bump is the tubercle, and this end here is called the head. These 2 parts are what touch the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, this articulates with the thoracic vertebrae on the posterior aspect here. posterior medial aspect. Okay, question, what structure is normally found attached to this part of the rib? And that's the costal cartilage. Okay, moving on, we want to know which of these ribs is which. Okay, so they've numbered them here for you. This is the first rib. This is the seventh rib. Okay, then you got your 3 false ribs and then your 2 floaters behind those. Okay, so what do we want to know? We want to know which of these are true ribs. Okay, so the true ribs here are 1 and 2. Okay, next question. The false ribs are going to be 3 and 4. Okay, and next question. The false floating ribs, only 4. The false non-floating ribs, only 3. Okay, the vertebral ribs, the ones that touch only the vertebrae, that's going to be number 4 again. The vertebral chondral rib is going to be number 3, okay, because it attaches to the vertebrae in the back and chondral cartilage here in the front, okay. And then finally the vertebrosternal ribs are going to be those with an attachment to the vertebrae in the sternum, and that's going to be 1 and 2 down here, okay. Okay, moving on. How many pairs of true ribs are there? And the answer, of course, is 7. And how many pairs of false ribs are there? There are 3 false ribs, and then finally there are 2 pairs of floating ribs. We want to match the terms on the left here with those on the right. A true rib, a vertebrosternal rib, a false non-floating rib, a vertebral chondral rib, and a false floating rib, a vertebral rib only. Okay, next question. List these bones in order from most superior to most inferior. Well, the first thing you want to do in this exercise is figure out which bones these are. Okay, that's the hyoid bone. That is a rib. Okay, this is the sacrum. This is the patella, and this is a lumbar vertebrae. A lumbar vertebrae. Okay, so in order from superior to inferior, it would go 4, then 5, then 2, then 3, then 1. Okay? You can look at the skeleton and make sure that those are the correct answers, but I assure you they are. Next question, what is this bone? This is true rib number 1. Doesn't look much like a rib, does it? And that's something that can be a little bit confusing. Okay? All right, last question we've got. What are some of these bones? A lot of these will come up more in the appendicular skeleton, but it's a good idea to be able to recognize these. That is a left scapula, that's the patella, and that is a left clavicle. Okay, so we'll stop here, and the next installment of Skeletal System will be appendicular, and look for it on YouTube very soon. I'll see everybody in class. Thanks.